Welcome to the Comic Binge. I am your host, Paul Herman. I will be joined shortly by the Reverend himself, Chris Clow, and our new buddy, Mr. Dylan from the Emerald City Hockey Podcast. Almost said podcast hockey. That's very backwards, and I'm very not smart. So if you haven't already tuned in, you know now that I'm not very smart. But that's okay. That's okay. I don't mind. So today we're going to talk about Blue Beetle comic books. Now, there's a lot of people who haven't seen the movie yet. That's fine. That's all fine and good. But you know what? I'm excited to talk about the comic books itself because we're the Comic Binge, yo. Like, what's how we do it? It's how we do it in the LBC or in the Comic Binge way. So anyway, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Really appreciate it. Hit the like button. Just interact. Leave love notes, aka comments. Really appreciate it. Just whatever you guys can do. It just means a lot to us. Trying to build the world of comic books. So yeah, without further ado, I'll bring on the Reverend himself first. Mr. Reverend, Chris Clow, you're back. What's up, man?
Hello, my friend. Not much. I got a cool new Absolute Edition today, so that's
show it off in a moment. We'll show it off in a moment. Well, I'm sure Dylan will appreciate this too.
Oh, I don't have it. I better go get it.
All
right.
You talk about. Go turn your camera off. And I'll bring Dylan.
All right. I'll be right
back.
God,
killing me. God. All right, and last but not least, Mr. Dylan, how we doing, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me back. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, dude. Like, well, when we first had you on, we were first talking, and I was like, well, I'd have you on the show, whatever, and talk about the movie. And you're like, yeah, I love the comics. I'm like, hold on, okay. Like, you love the comics? You're like, yeah. I'm like, well, maybe you want to talk about the comics. Thinking I was just like, if we're gonna do a hockey analogy. I was volume shooting at this point, right?
Yes.
I'm like just throwing whatever it is, seeing what happens. And you went, yeah, I'll do that. I'm like, well, by golly, all right.
No, I don't like not love this series or anything, you know.
Nice. Which we're gonna dive deep into all things Blue Beetle here. So we're gonna talk about, I think everyone's history, minus mine, because it's very like I'll take 2 seconds to do mine. We'll dive into both yours and to Chris's here. Chris is more the DC guy, more the Marvel guy. And Dylan, you kind of told me you're more of a DC guy, right? I think you told me. Yeah. So we'll get your history with this character and the character itself of Blue Beetle, and talk about just maybe some of the changes from the comics to the books the comics to the movie, and we'll kind of go from there. So before we do that, let's let Chris have his let's let Chris brag a little bit. Chris, why don't you show us what you got on the show today for us?
Superman for All Seasons, the Absolute Edition.
Ooh,
this is a very pretty book. It's
got
a really nice canvas layer on both the slipcase and on the book itself. And there's a really nice introduction in it that's written by Jeff Loeb, where he details that this was actually a relatively recently found image that Tim Sale rendered for I think a collected edition that never got used. So they decided to use it for the Absolute Edition. They tracked down Bjarne Hansen, who was the original watercolorist on the original series, and he put his magic on this, and that's the new cover for the Absolute Edition. But this also has a couple of other Loeb Sale Superman collaborations, including his prom night that was depicted, I think, in Solo #1, and the rare sort of first encounter that young Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne had that was in a Secret Files and Origins issue of Superman Batman that Loeb and Sale did.
Hey, can you do me a favor? Can you like show a couple of the pages, like up close to the camera? Just show the whole 3 people watching who watch this. So it's good. It's good.
There's a good one there.
Oh my God! Now those look.
I mean, it looks
nice.
It's pretty nice. I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. I've always had a really great personal affinity for this story, and it's just like, I don't know. I mean, the Loeb and Sale collaborations people often cite Long Halloween or Dark Victory, or maybe Spider-Man Blue or Daredevil Yellow, Hulk Gray. I don't know. This one might be my favorite. So love this one. It's a great story.
I am probably of the minority of not being the biggest of the Tim's. I love Tim Sale's artwork, and his layouts. I'm just not the biggest of the collaboration as much as other people. I think they
You've
have
never
good
read
stuff.
this.
I have read it and I have it. I don't have the absolute, obviously.
You sure?
Bro, I've read for all seasons. I got really into Smallville. Come on, man.
Oh, that was a very important.
I know. That's why I read it. That's why I read it. I own the trade. I can probably. Well, I don't want to get it right now. Dylan's gonna go to bed at some point.
The clearest, most fundamental difference between something like For All Seasons and The Long Halloween is that Long Halloween Bruce narrates, and in For All Seasons, it starts off with Jonathan narrating, and it goes to Lois, and it goes to Lex, then it goes to Lana to round things out, and you get a whole different vibe from these people who are interacting with this extraordinary guy from an early stage of his life all the way up through the time where he's the beacon and symbol of heroism that we all see Superman as. So,
well, I have read it. I like it. I just don't like hold it to like. It's just not my. It's not the first thing I think of Superman, to be honest. Just me. Dylan, any thoughts before we move on to Blue Beetle for Superman for All Seasons?
I haven't read it. I like the collaboration between those two. Jeff Loeb's one of my favorite, writers of all time. Love that stuff. Love his film stuff. Obviously, love Tim Sale's artwork.
Commando, right?
Yes, he wrote that in college just cause.
I know.
Yeah, the whole
Why wouldn't you?
Get started is fantastic. But yeah, so I'm gonna have to check it out. It looks great.
It's beautiful.
Okay. Our friend, our good friend Javi. If you ever watch or come on the show again, Dylan, with Javi, he's amazing. I broke his heart today. He goes, "Oh, are you gonna get it?" I went, "No." And he goes, "Why not?" I'm like, "I don't know." It broke his heart, man. Chris, it broke his heart. I felt bad.
Maybe you should reconsider. This is something that's fixable.
But bro, I've got so many other books to get. I was looking at my in-stock trade wish list. There's I got so many Star Wars books.
You can see, and you're just pushing Superman aside. I see how it is. All right.
Because Star Wars is first. You know it is. Anyway, I digress. All right. Anyway, all right. So today we're going to be talking about Blue Beetle comic books, excuse me. I guess it's plural. We could have, Blue Beetles or whatever. We're going to talk about Blue Beetle comic books. Predominantly, we're going to focus on is it 2006-7 run? 6. Is that 6? Okay, 2006 run by many different people. We'll get into the creators here in a little bit. But the movie came out heavily based off, let's say, this initial run, I would say. Dylan, would you say that's safe to say as well?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so with this, people, and obviously Blue Beetle, unfortunately, has not set the world on fire. I'm bummed that it's not, excuse me. I'm bummed that it's not doing better, but at the same time, it's doing okay, I think, for what it is.
Yeah.
And I do think that for the people, I think there are people out there who are more interested in general, whether they watch the movie or not. And I think it's worth having this piece as a evergreen, if you will, show, so people can get into comic books and know, I think, where the best time to start is, in my opinion. And I'm only going to defer to you guys because I'm assuming this was the best spot to go. But we'll throw it to the experts, which I'll throw to Dylan first because he's the biggest Blue Beetle fan here. Give me a little bit of your history of this character, kind of going into this 2006 series here, Dylan.
Yeah, so 2006, I would have been 12. I came to this while it was still ongoing, but I think the first trade had already been out. One of probably my favorite, comic book character is Booster Gold. And so I was, heavy reading the Booster Gold stuff. Obviously, he had the relationship with the Ted Kord Blue Beetle. That's just a huge part of who his character has been historically. And then with his series coming out of 52, started in 2007. So it was a little after. That's right around when I came in. He goes and he tries to save the Ted Kord Blue Beetle. And so I kind of got introduced to the Ted Kord Blue Beetle that way. And then, looking on the shelf, I'm like, oh, there's this other Blue Beetle Jaime Reyes, and he's, a teenager, and I was like 12, 13 at that time, and I was like, all right, this works. Let me pick this up. Let me pick up the first trade, see what it's about. Read it, fell in love with the banter, all that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, I was the target age demographic for it. It all worked, and I ended up, just every time the new trade came out, I picked it up, and I got through that whole series, and it's just been one of my favorites that I've come back to now, over half my life later.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so sorry I was muted there. One of the things that as I got back into comics right around this, well, a couple years before this, but it was kind of a more gradual thing where I'm a Marvel zombie. I've always been a Marvel zombie, always will be. I'm dedicated, but I definitely love DC more. But when at this time in my life, I was just kind of looking at it from a peripheral, like, oh, there's this DC thing going on. I always was enamored with the Blue Beetle costume, this new costume that we got here. And I remember, coming out of Infinite Crisis. I mean, I remember seeing all this at the time, and I definitely wanted to always check it out. And when I got in, back into, reading comics really heavily and haven't looked back really since, I got the Blue Beetle trades here. We talked about that here on the show or before the show. I got the first two, which I thought I only had the first two, and then I was looking for all my stuff. I'm like, oh, I have the first three. Sweet. I was like, bonus. I totally forgot. And I remember I read, I think only the first one, and I liked it, but it didn't draw me in. We'll get into all that.
Yeah.
So I kind of stopped. And then really quickly, I'll throw it back to you guys. When me and Chris, we used to work on a show called Modern Myth Media, and who I'm on a show with now, Marvel Newscast Show, Marvel Fan Show, excuse me. That was the old name. Marvel Fan Show. Sean, we're all part of the New 52, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to do all of us all broke up our host here. We were on the show, the Modern Myth Media. We broke up all the comics. I got I was going to say, I got the crap. You could say I got all the leftover because I wasn't a Marvel guy and not a DC guy. Everyone got, but no one wanted. But funny enough, Chris, no one wanted at first the Batman and Robin book with Peter Tomasi. So I got that at first, and I was like, this is actually pretty good. But I got all of these other books. Blue Beetle was one of them. And I want to ask you before we get any further, but I'll just wrap up my quick thing here. I think I bought the first two issues and reviewed them, and I told Sean, I can't do this. This is bad. This book is bad. Did you like when they went over to New 52? Did you like the new iteration? Because I couldn't take it. I was like, this is awful.
Yeah, and I was somebody who was kind of on board with the idea of the New 52. Like, I remember how controversial it was, at the comic book shop and all that kind of stuff. But I was also young. I was still like a teenager, so I was like, yeah, why not start things over for me? That's fine. I don't have a 30-year history with any of these characters yet. This one though, I think I got like the first 6 or 7 issues because I was like, look, I loved that other series. Like, it's gonna, let's go. And it was like they took the worst elements of this series and they just made that the New 52 Blue Beetle. It's really, really rough. I don't recommend it.
Yeah, Chris, do you know who wrote those comics? I don't want to talk SH, but it's just not great. Anyone? Yeah.
Tony Bedard kicked it off. I don't know if he wrote the entire thing.
I don't even know who that is, so that probably tells you a lot.
He has a pretty solid DC track record.
Oh, he's a DC guy? Okay.
Yeah, like he did a really cool Rebels series that used Vril Dox or Brainiac 2. He was slated to be a writer for The Outsiders before Chuck Dixon kind of came back. He wrote stuff for Secret Origin. He wrote stuff for Teen Titans. He wrote a couple of fill-ins for Gotham City Sirens.
Okay, he's kind of like a utility player.
He did Green Lantern Corps for the very end of the series after Tomasi jumped to a Guy Gardner centric series. So he has some good bona fides, you might say. But yeah, I mean,
sure,
not every series is going to be a home run.
That's fair. Yeah, it was a bummer because I love this costume. I think the costume is great. So
Green Lantern New Guardian. So he was very closely tied to Kyle Rayner, near the end of the DCU and kind of into the New 52.
Okay. All right. So Chris, what's your before we go kind of into the comics here itself? What's your history with this particular Jaime Reyes character in the comic books? Because you're a big Infinite Crisis fan. You made me read it for God's sakes.
I did.
So I mean, it's true. There's a whole series, Dylan. If you want to, me and Chris, there's even a great. I even put a clip out there. I found on YouTube there, where if you go to the comic pitch clips, there's a best friends fighting. Over the crises, and we're talking and we're arguing about this all through that series. It's a great series with the Mr. Baby and Papa Nick. It's super fun. But anyway, Chris, I know, loves Infinite Crisis. Blue Beetle came from Infinite Crisis. Chris, what's your take on Jaime Reyes?
So you want me to start at Jaime? We'll do the other stuff.
Yeah, we'll do the other stuff. We'll say that other history stuff at the end. Towards the end.
I was reading Infinite Crisis, so I saw Jaime, his first appearance, unfold while I was reading the DC event series that was driving the ship at DC. And I mean, Infinite Crisis itself, Jaime doesn't play an extremely important role in it, but he does play a pivotal one at a critical time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that makes people generally stand up and pay attention. But I think one of the other things that's worth keeping in mind about Jaime's original appearances is that a lot of people were still very raw about the loss of Ted Cord. Yeah. So the idea of another Blue Beetle coming into the fold pretty quickly was a very disruptive one for a fair amount of fans. Certainly a lot of people that I talked to picking the books up at my comic shop. So I think that a lot of people just kind of took a wait and see approach. Like, he's a likable kid. He's an affable kid within the pages of Infinite Crisis, but that's not really enough to go on for the long haul. So let's see how things pan out. And then once 1 year later came around and Jaime had his own series, and they were actually going to be diving into like the consequences of him being gone for a year after Infinite Crisis. Like, it's a pretty interesting hook, especially for a guy who is a legacy character. DC's always been pretty solid with legacy characters, and Jaime is no exception to that. He brings the identity forward without just being a repeat of the guy who had the identity before. And Keith Giffen made a very, very critical decision by giving Jaime his own identity, his own cast of supporting characters, with enough connective tissue to the guy that we had spent, 20 some odd years reading at that point in the post-crisis era. So I thought it was a really solid way to kick things off with him.
Yeah, so for someone like you, Dylan, who take me with really quickly. Let me take us on your little journey of comic books. How familiar were you with comic books at this time, and like in the rich history of like these, like a legacy character like Blue Beetle? I'm curious.
Right. So I really wasn't, because I'm,
sure.
I was started going to the comic book shop that I still go to. Shout out Collector's Paradise in the Valley, up to 3 locations now. And I started going when I was 11 years old. And so, right, like, there's not a lot of room for history, and there's certainly not enough room to really know at that time, how long the history is, what's good, what was impactful, what was the stuff that was like, groundbreaking for its time, and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So I didn't have a lot of background when I was kind of jumping in. I was coming in right as 52 was finishing up, was really kind of right when I was coming in. And so, yeah, I was just kind of trying all sorts of different things. I had the wonderful staff there, pointing me in certain directions, and just talking with people, all that kind of stuff. As far as like Blue Beetle went, like I said, I'd started off, I liked Booster Gold from reading the 52 stuff. I started reading his solo book, the one that was, it started up right after 52 ended. It was written by Jeff Johns, illustrated by Jeff Katz, and that was my introduction to the idea of Blue Beetle, because the first 2 arcs of that are him trying to go back in time to save Ted Cord. And then the repercussions of him doing so is the second arc. And so that was my introduction to the concept of Blue Beetle, but I hadn't read Infinite Crisis when I hopped on with the Jaime Reyes stuff. Like, I was just hopping on with the beginning of him, and I was just like, all right, I guess he went and he helped Batman and Green Arrow and all that stuff, and now he's here.
See, I see. There's something here I really want to touch on. I think you did a beautiful job of saying what so many people are so hesitant to read comic books, especially with superhero comics. I understand there's a hesitancy, like I don't know what I'm getting myself into,
Yeah.
and I love how you simply say exactly what people are always afraid of, and you just didn't care. You're like, oh, I just assumed this, and you moved on. Like that is like the problem with people, and I think with superhero comics specifically. Like I would say it's mainstream stuff. Like obviously independent artsy fartsy stuff, like that's different. But with these heavy like history, people always say, "Well, I don't know where to start. I don't know," which again I feel is a little bit of a cop out because here's the thing. You read a comic book, like there's everyone. I didn't know what the hell I was doing when I was reading Spider-Man. I was like, oh yeah, Spider-Man's married now. Cool. I don't know, like whatever, like right, like we don't know. We just read and can start piecing things together as we read them. And I love how you picked up on that. Like, oh yeah, you assume that, and if you need to learn it, you'll figure it out eventually. Like you don't worry about having to know every single detail. I think that's the problem. There's like a mediums like with TV and with movies, it's such an easier way to go into and go, well, I know everything because I can watch it in 45 minutes. Whereas like these superhero things have so much history, you have to realize that every writer is not going to play off every aspect of history in one issue. You know what I mean? Like it's not how it works.
Yeah, no, it's not relevant. And I've told so many people throughout the years, like, and I think this is a good example of it too. The first couple issues of this, right? It gives you what you need to know, right? What you need to know to get involved in this story with this character at this point in time. It gives it to you in the first couple pages. Like that's all you need. You're in it. You're off. You can go. You can then go on the journey of him, reassimilating back into his life, and you're fine. And I think comics in general do a really, really good job of that, right? Whether it's them doing flashback stuff and kind of working with the timeline like this does, or it's just the simple, there's the little asterisk, and then you see the editor's note down at the bottom of the page. It just says, so something and something happens. You want to see it? Check out this comic, and it's like, all right, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the reason the binge exists is to get people with whether they want to go to independent comics or if they're like we cover a lot, which we'll eventually cover more independent stuff eventually. We try to, but it just doesn't always happen because we love superhero comics. So we grew up on that. Me and Reverend, we love them. The one thing I'm trying to like destroy is that whole like stigma around comic books of like, oh, we can't read them because. And you just openly like, yeah, when I was a kid, I had no idea what to, okay, cool. Like you just in having there's it's not as crazy as people make it out to be. I feel like it's more of a cop out than anything personally. Again, that's just me, but I'm glad you brought that up. Reverend, are you, when you read this, you didn't read it all the way. Like you didn't read it on a regular basis. You kind of, do you give me like, when did you read this exactly? Did you ever read it?
I started the series when it came out. I fell off of it probably about 3 or 4 in just because I was buying a bunch of other books at the time. And then when I started working at a comic book store, it became pretty easy to check in on this series a little more regularly just to keep up with what was going on. And I think I stuck with it really for the first, I guess through 24 before I just kind of turned my attention to other things. Issue number 20, I think, is actually really interesting just because that was like one of the only tie-ins to the Sinestro Corps War. Sinestro Corps War was largely pretty self-contained in Green Lantern and Green Lantern Corps, and a couple of other little tie-in books that were separate, independent, but in terms of like a whole other monthly title that didn't have anything to do with Green Lantern, Blue Beetle number 20 was the only one that dealt with a little bit of the fallout of the Sinestro Corps War. And I thought that was fun, and it clearly they went a little too balls out with the tie-ins by the time Blackest Night rolled around. But the idea of seeing what the impact is of that, especially with the very capable pencils of Raphael Albuquerque, who has gone on to be something of a comic superstar because of his collaborations with Scott Snyder. That was cool to see. And so I feel like I got in on the ground floor on Raphael Albuquerque before he even did American Vampire because of Blue Beetle.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I was going to ask about that. We'll kind of dive into the series a little bit. We'll just I'm not sure how we're going to do it exactly, but we'll start kind of at the beginning here. And just talk about the creators a little bit. Like I'm not really familiar with John Rogers. It's funny. I was just thinking today, has he done anything else? And I was looking at in stock trades, and the first thing in stock new release is like John Rogers, like it's written something like right on the new release. I'm like, well, I guess he is. All right. So which is cool. I'm not familiar with him as much. I'm not sure if he's a DC guy. Maybe you guys might know more than me. Keith Giffen, Giffen, whatever. I always do that. I like him a lot. I love obviously the DeMatteis Brouhaha era. His work in 52 is so incredible, and we're gonna be doing the next episode next month, which I can't wait for volume 3. I'm meaning to jump on that again, Chris, and so I'm excited to see that. And then he's integral, in my opinion, for that series. Doing the layouts, and it was interesting to read this. I'm going to go ahead and say we'll just kind of cover it in chunks, and we can go over issues. We can also go all over the place too, Dylan, if you want, and Chris. But kind of covering with the first 5 issues here. I'll be honest, and I think I DM'd this to you too. I was like, it's okay. Like, this is all right. Like, it didn't. There's elements in these first 5 issues, in my opinion, that I think are there and really interesting. It's not executed the best, I feel. It's not terrible by any means, but just not as like good as it could be, it feels like, especially after watching the movie, which I thought did a phenomenal job of it. Which you can get a little more of the details here, which I'll say my main criticisms later, but I'm just going to tell people right now before I throw it to you, Dylan. I think if people are going to start reading, these Blue Beetle comic books, which I think if you want to go into, I'm going to get into my promotional of reading comics here. If you want to go crazy and go on to the DC Universe app and read them, you can go right to the 2006 Blue Beetle stuff, or Comixology, or if you want to go to Hoopla, which is another great one. No one goes on. It's fantastic. But anyway, this is the first issue. As you guys can see here, this is what the trade looks like. If you want to go go hunt the trades down or whatever. But on the first issue for digital is going to be this one right here. The first 5 issues, I don't think are the strongest of the series. I read the first 19. I ironically stopped with the issue that Chris was raved about with the Sinestro War. Didn't love it. Liked it. Okay. Didn't love it. Dylan, what's your take rereading these comics now and these first 5 issues ish?
Yeah, so this kind of reread through for me, I was doing it with the idea of like, okay, if I was someone new to this series, like, let me take off the nostalgia goggles because, I've read this so many times. I grew up with it. And yeah, I think what you came away with is pretty on point. It's you've got this new character, right? You've got the normal stuff of like, okay, teenager, he's now got superpowers, like, oh, he's got to figure this out, his family's around, oh my gosh, he's a superhero now, like, we got to figure this out, all that kind of stuff, him and his friends and the banter. And I think that's the strongest stuff of all of this. The problem, in my opinion, mostly with the beginnings of this, is that they don't really give him a lot to do. He doesn't have a lot to do. The people he's going against is just kind of like a local magic gang, and there's a lot of magic. There's so much magic in this. Like, we introduce this character who gets his superpowers from alien technology, and then you're like, natural foil magic, right? But like small scale local El Paso, so like we're already that's
like, the posse.
That's like different. Yeah, just the posse. But just like there was so much potential with the idea of like, okay, we're going with like a real place, right? This isn't a Gotham, a metropolis, a central city like the DC normally does. Like, they're actually going like to the quintessential border town USA, and they're like, and we're just gonna have the bad guys be the posse, and they have like minor magic powers, and that's like the introduction to him and everything. And I still, that's the biggest thing for me, is that you don't really get to see him flex, or I don't feel like they do a good job of really pushing him and us getting to see who Jaime really is as a hero, and the sacrifices he's willing to make, and the way he's going to go about, training the Scarab not to kill and all that kind of stuff. I don't feel like that first trade, those first 5 issues, do a really good job of that at all. But the things that I do think it does really well is the banter with his friends and stuff. and
Yeah.
that allows it to work away from an inner monologue. And I'm someone who, yes, obviously I love Batman, I love Batman comics, all that kind of stuff, and I hate inner monologues in comics. And I know that's such a big part of all this,
Mm.
but I come from film, right? My background's in screenwriting and stuff like that. I'm like, either show me or have them at least talk about it with somebody else. Like, there's other ways of doing this without just having to be in their head. And I think it works really well for Batman, but I think it would have really been done a disservice here. I like the fact that he has other teenagers he can talk to, or he has his family, his dad he can go and talk to about these things instead of just brooding on it in his room like an emo teenager from the mid 2000s.
Well, you brought up really quick, Chris. I'll throw it to you here in a second. You brought up a great point, and I love about the medium of comic books, and having your film background is so interesting because film and comics are so interconnected, in my opinion, because of the visual medium, and because it's not moving literally, but it's sequentially moving,
Yes.
and it's a weird, like they're weird cousins, but I love that you brought that up because the inner monologue, the inner thought bubbles is one of those things where the captions, it's overused in I would say in mainstream comic books. It's overused. Part of the problem though is that a lot of these, like Spider-Man's another one that has this too. And I love Spider-Man, but because if you don't have a team book, like you said, you're not talking off other people. So you can't get exposition out and get emotion out through other people because if they're swinging by themselves or driving the car by themselves, you want to get, if they're, you know what I mean? You're trying to get things and emotion out there. The only way to do that is by the novel approach, right? Which is the, right. Again, narration, whatever. I would agree with you. It's overused in mainstream superhero comic books. 100, it's a crutch. And I do feel like, and sometimes it's necessary, right? Like it's like in film, my wife we're watching something the other day and she looks at me and goes, exposition. I'm like, duh, like I get it. Like, like I'm not, I know you have to have this in mainstream films, Morgan, my wife, like you can't like, whatever. Right. By the way, we're watching Ahsoka. That's why she was like, no, whatever. I get it. You like Star Wars. But I just want to say, like, I do feel that the one thing this doesn't do is have that as much. And you have the friends, and this is nice. But here it leads me to a criticism. And Chris, I'll throw it to you, get your take on this. At least in the first 5 issues, I do think that there's way too many characters in this. There's way too many characters. It's like, I'm like, wait, who's this? Oh, this is my aunt. This is my aunt's bodyguard, who's now a bad guy. It's like, wait, what? I'm like, oh yeah, it's this guy. Or who's this guy? Well, here's our friend over here. Here's the posse. I'm like, whoa. Let's time out here. Let's time out. Who's going on? Like, what's going on here? To me, it's just way too much going on. That's just my opinion. I think that does a book a disservice. And the last thing I'll throw before I throw it to you, Chris, you bring up a great point, Dylan. The whole magic thing is fine. I don't mind. I mean, whatever, right? It's superhero stuff. But you start your book off with Guy Gardner and Blue Beetle duking it out here and like whatever, right? Like having a rat, like setting up the fact that they are like mortal enemies, which we also get back here in a little bit with issue 14, which is a great issue. I love this issue a lot, actually. You get a little more history, which you had kind of alluded to back in the last episode too, Dylan. But yeah, like you set that whole thing up with Matt, and then with science fiction, and it's like, oh, guess what? Magic. Here's a weird ogre guy that's gonna walk around. I was like, what? Like the pot? What? So anyway, I just. This isn't bad. It's just not the strongest start. So if you're going to start, when you start off with these comic books, just take that in mind or keep that in mind and don't just throw it away and be like, I'm not ready. This isn't my thing. Keep reading. We'll get to the next set of issues next. Chris, what's your take?
The amount of characters didn't bother me. I think that the reason it didn't bother me was because it felt more populated than it probably otherwise. I mean, you go to series that normally kick off and introduce us to new characters. There aren't normally this many characters within the principal hero's orbit. And for some reason, I just felt like that made it feel really well built out. Pacing was probably my chief complaint, but it's not a very heavy complaint. I think that Cully Hamner's pencils are very good at evoking emotions. And I got a big kick out of seeing the Phantom Stranger show up when he did.
For
So
why? I don't really remember. Or not. It's like it's very like blinking, you'll miss it. And he's like, "I'm the Phantom Stranger."
yeah,
Comes
but
back
that's one
in.
of the things.
Hi.
Like sometimes you need those blink and you miss it cameos to
Add
reinforce
intrigue.
the concept of the world that this kid is a part of, right? I mean, those are the kinds of things that can pay off later. You never know, and I don't necessarily think this does
This doesn't really
per
pay off
se,
anything. It's just like
but
a weird guest star, in my
it does
opinion.
reinforce the idea that Jaime is in a larger world, and that you never know who's going to show up or why they might show up
Right,
in
right.
future issues. So that's, I mean, it's sort of like the reason why Game of Thrones kills every other character every other episode, right? It keeps you guessing.
I can't believe you brought
So
Game of Thrones with Blue Beetle. That's so weird.
yeah, well, they're very different, but and Blue Beetle's better, but you know,
Wow. That's certainly a take. I can't believe you just
the character is
listen,
better. The
listen.
character.
I'm not here to judge. I just think it's a very interesting take. Anyway,
But
continue.
it just, I mean, as a fan of the shared world and a fan of that narrative and canonical construct, I think it's a cool thing to throw in every once in a while, just to remind you, yeah, this is a story in the DC universe. Jaime has his own problems, his own friends, his own enemies, his own motivations. But at the end of the day, when things do need to link up, as we will see later in this series, uh, then they totally can. So I actually really enjoyed the dynamic between Jaime and a lot of his friends. The family is not as much of a presence as it is in the movie, certainly, but it is there. Like the beginnings of it are there, and it's fun to see. So
I
yeah, I
I'm
enjoyed it.
we talked about this last week, and Dylan, I know we echoed this, and Chris, I think we all it seems like we're all in agreement that the family aspect is probably better in the movie than in the comics overall. It's not bad in the comics; it's just a much better, I think, dynamic and interest with the grandmother, and which I haven't read. Again, I haven't read all the way through. I'm assuming she's not there, but the older sister, the sister's older, more of a contemporary or a friend, if you will, kind of that friend group we talked about, the sacrifice a little bit through the sister, which I thought was fine. But yeah, like I would say that the comic definitely doesn't have the strongest, I'd say, progression with the family as much as the movie does. That being said, it does get stronger as we go. But anyone before we can move on to the next section of issues, Dylan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as much as in the movie, clearly, right? It's not at all. Although I think, especially in the first two issues of this, right, it does a good job of you understand how important the family is to him and how
Yeah,
important he is to the family as he is showing up a year later, and they're,
which is
they've thought
yeah,
he's long gone, right, at that point,
right, right.
and he has to work himself back in. You very much get that. I also think that the dynamic between him and his family is it walks that thin line between being like really realistic and like falling too much into like a sitcom, where they're just making
Yeah,
quips back and forth to each other. There are times where it crosses that line and it gets a little like, okay, but a lot of it is also, like I grew up with a younger sister, like that's just what it is, right? Where it's like,
yeah,
you could have the coolest or the most important thing in the world going on, but she's just like, hey, shut up, I'm trying to watch TV here. Right. And it's like, okay, like I
yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah, and you brought and you guys both brought this up. I wanted to say my favorite aspect of the book, which I was not prepared for, was the 1 year later aspect. That was interesting. And having that dynamic of having him show up again after they thinking he was gone, the friends and everything, that was cool. I will say that was an interesting, I think a good idea to take the character because I wasn't anticipating that.
There's a way to tie it into 1 year later without tying into 1 year later.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
at the
Yeah,
same time.
because when I
So
read it, I went, "Oh yeah, 1 year later," but I didn't catch on to that. Does that make sense? Like I didn't that didn't matter to me. I felt like it was
which
very
in some
isolated.
respect might be kind of a shame because I feel like there could have been a place for Jaime in 52, but he was gone. So,
Sure.
it's kind of a bummer. But also, too, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that uh, the movie, I think, went out of its way to be defined by the family dynamic.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah,
something that
yeah.
sets it apart from the original series. And the movie also comes at it with a whole other level of cultural authority, certainly considering the
Absolutely.
creative team.
Which is awesome.
So
Which makes the movie great.
yeah,
You know?
that all contributes to the cohesion that we felt for the family in the film that we don't necessarily get from this series. So that's
Yeah.
just one of the reasons why they're different. But I think you can see the beginnings of the idea of amping up those familial connections by the time we get to the movie.
Yeah.
I don't
Totally.
know how much of a button they use with the family in the New 52 series because I kind of forgot it.
No one knows. No one knows, Chris. Nobody knows. And I mean that's outside of us. Nobody knows. So moving on, really quick, is Coley Hamner still making comics?
I think so.
I like his stylized art. I'm sure he's still working. I haven't seen him much in at least in mainstream stuff anyway. I do like his stylized art. It didn't always fit. I thought what the not I thought it fit Blue Beetle, like the character fine. It's just the other stuff, like the magic stuff, didn't always fit for me. I felt like it as we see as it goes on before Albuquerque comes on, it feels like it's stronger when he does more fantastical or more science fiction, I should say. Not fantastical, like I don't know. It's just like some of the posse stuff I thought was not my favorite. But when Blue Beetle's fighting Guy Gardner, it looks fantastic, and there's a lot of great imagery with Blue Beetle himself. I think the Hammer does a great job of.
I guess it's been about 6 years since Hamner did stuff, at least for DC. It seems
right.
like he's being fed pretty well from being attached to Red. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah.
I didn't know he did Red. Okay, cool. I never read that. So add it to the binge. Next section is going to be issues 7 through 14. Which this is when I'll be honest. This is when the title really started hitting like home for me. And like it took a little bit, but I'll be honest, and again, we try not to keep the spoilers on as much as I can because I want people to read these comics for fun. I would say once, which is it's fine, whatever. Which I want to add one more massive thing we'll talk about, which is hilarious. It ties into the modern DC universe of films, you could say. Dude, issue I'll find it here. This issue number 10, I think, is just this is when the title really started hitting for me. And it's when his friend gets the mother box from her aunt, which again, this is you're starting to mirror like the Ted Kord's daughter from the movie into this, and like the sister or the Ted Kord's sister into this, the movie and the book kind of you start seeing the connections a little bit, like not one for one, but the inspirations. This is when the book started taking off for me, and to me, I love this. And this is when you get to the New Gods and like all that stuff, and you start getting the deeper of the DC comic books lore. I started really liking it a lot more personally. I started really taking off for me. I'm curious what you guys thought. I started really liking this, and then this is when I think Roger takes over fully after issue 12. But Giffen kind of leads into his New God stuff. But I started loving this after this. I thought this was great. It's right in its stride. Dylan, what's your take on these next section of issues?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think this is really when it starts picking up. I think the first start of it picking up is a little bit earlier in that trade. I'm trying to remember which one. The one where they go on the road trip and they visit Dan Garrett's granddaughter. That to me is like the first one where it's like, okay, now we're starting to make connections to past Blue Beetles. Jaime's a little bit more aware of who he is at this point. He has a better handle on the scarab and the suit and all that kind of stuff. And so he can start, being his own person as a superhero, being his own superhero, if you will. And I think that's where it first starts. And then it kind of dips down a little bit again, and then right where you say with issue 10 it picks back up. And look, for me, I'm a huge New Gods fan. I don't know about the two of you, but like you put the New Gods in anything, I'm going to read it and I'm going to enjoy it. I'm just going to be like, it doesn't matter who it is, just throw someone in from that universe and I'm sold. So I really like that. But it's again, it's the first time you're bringing in some of the more sci-fi elements to this sci-fi book, right? Again, he's got alien technology. That's the whole point of who he is and where his powers come from. And you're starting to bring in the sci-fi, or even just the more, like, in this sense, classic fantasy stuff. And I just think it works so much better for him and the personality that they give him, where he's going to be more of like a teenager who has seen more than anybody would ever expect to see in their entire life, but they're still a teenager, so they don't necessarily appreciate that yet. So they're just kind of going with things, and they're just kind of in that loose, like, okay, I guess whatever. This is just what life is now, right? They're not, you're not old enough to have the wisdom to fully understand the repercussions of all the actions. You don't have necessarily all the things you need to be worrying about as an adult or as someone who's been around for a longer period of time. Jaime's just very much like, still kind of gung ho, like, wow, this is my life now. I get to go and, get sent by this mother box across the universe. And I think that's where his character shines the most, and where he can kind of separate himself from other superheroes, at least within the DC universe.
Yeah, well, and I do like the New Gods. I need to learn more about them, but it really felt like a lot. It felt more fresh because honestly, there's less characters that he was interacting with, and it felt more of an isolated story. And then, like, it focused on him as a. I think you brought that up. It focused on him specifically, and it was nice to get that before Giffen leaves. And I don't know, I just really enjoyed seeing him interact with, like, the whole dynamic with his friend. I always forget her friend. I'm so terrible with names. People who are watching, I can't remember anyone's name. So, but
Brenda?
Anyway, Brenda, have the aunt aspect, trying to save her, and how she really loves her niece. And then, like, we got to keep her, the fact that they have a kind of a loose agreement. I love having that whole thing dynamic being built up. That's interesting. It was a really refreshing kind of take. I'm like, oh yeah, like this is what a Spider-Man like character would be in the DC universe. And it felt very perfect for that. It felt like it finally hit that perfect stride at this point for me. I will say I'd be remiss to bring up the fact that when I'm reading this, I'm like, wait a minute, Peacemaker is in this? Like, it was just hilarious. I didn't get Peacemaker picture. I should have done that. I was very ill prepared. But he's not wearing the toilet seat, which bums me out. That costume's amazing. And it just shows you the difference of times. If you would have told me, Peacemaker's in this book, but he's not going to be wearing his new rad costume at all, but they had to revamp it and make it look better. But now it's like you would never not see him in that rad toilet seat costume. Which I love calling it that. But it is, I love that costume. I think it's great. It's just really weird, connected with the modern DC, universe of films, whatever. And Peacemaker has, like, he's an appearance. He's like a pretty prominent character in this, which is hilarious. So, I thought the series really started taking off for me right here. Chris, what's your take? I don't know how far you've read, if you read these issues or not.
I got up to 12 before I had to move on to other things. But the thing that I remember the most about reading these at the time was that we were just starting to get a hint of what Final Crisis was about to be. And it seemed like the New Gods were going to be playing a very big role in that series. So I remember being a part of forums and talking to people in the shop and being like,
one of those.
What do we need to keep an eye on when it comes to the New Gods? And Blue Beetle came up in conversation. They're showing up there. Really? They're showing up there? That's another thing where it's something that contributes to the embeddedness in the DC universe, because you can't get more DC than the New Gods, really.
Yeah, it's true.
So I was pretty psyched by the fact that they were even being included in the conversation for something like this. And I think that they were used in a creative way. It didn't really end up meaning all that much in the scheme of things for Final Crisis. Grant Morrison decided to go off in a whole other direction. The series is great for it, but
we're gonna find all about it here in a couple of weeks when we start the official episode. Or is it the negative episode? What are we talking about this next episode we're gonna do?
It'll be the first one. It'll be the first one when we read the Black Case book.
The Black Case book.
Oh, I guess we haven't really announced. We'll talk about it later. But,
we'll talk about it later. Yeah.
For people who care. But
it's a
I mean, it's just fun. It adds to the fun. and it does keep the energy really high for a series like this. And Jaime himself is just affable, but he's also very determined, and it just makes you root for him. Like
Yeah,
the craziest things that the DC universe can throw at him are throwing them at him, and
that's true. Yeah.
he has that determination to keep powering through. He's not always the most sure of himself when he does, but he still pushes forward. And who does that remind people of? It probably reminds people a fair amount of Ted Kord. So we're getting some vibes here about why he is the Blue Beetle.
Yeah, and really quickly before we move on to the next section, and I'll throw it to you for any last thoughts on these next section of issues. But I love the fact we got. I think it's in this section where we get the Ted Kord. Or wait, no, that's in the next. I'll say that. I'll say the Ted Kord thing for next. Yeah, it just felt like they started like getting the voice of Jaime, I thought, down in these issues, and it was nice to get. And I would say to people, if you're getting into Blue Beetle comics, initially, right, issue 6 through about 12, this is the trade if you guys want. Again, it's on Hoopla, DC Universe 2006 Blue Beetle. This is when the series really starts to take off, and these first, I would say, these 6 to 12 issues, and they're fun, man. And like I said, that they go through a lot of history, but it feels like they finally figured things out for the most part. And I forgot that one thing I want to highlight was the issue where, and I'll find I think it's the first one. Yeah, it's this one where he talks about being gone for a year, and he recounts with being with the Justice League and all the heroes that he's working with and how scary it was. And he like breaks down at one point. It's this issue. This is one of the better issues. I thought this is what kind of made me kind of go, oh, that was very well done. That was a very good standalone issue. I feel like you could read this. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say you probably can read this issue alone, start here, and be good to go, in my opinion. But that's just me. Don't tell anyone else. Issue 7, I thought if you read that by itself, you're in. Like, because it has the family dynamic, it's got the superhero stuff, and it's got like him. As you see the progression of the character and where he's at emotionally at the very end. And I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was one of the better issues of the whole series, maybe. Kind of dips a little bit there, but it starts to, for me, this is one of the standout issues. And then we get really fun in the New Gods a few issues later. But yeah, I love that issue. So any parting words before we go on the next section?
I think we covered it pretty well.
All right. Did you like this issue?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and especially because I was someone who didn't read Infinite Crisis, and so it kind of filled in some of the gaps, at least as it related to Jaime, that I didn't have.
Yeah.
Right? So it's one of those that it was like it's really important to all that. I think that's where you start really seeing the bond between him and his family in a different way, right? It doesn't have the sitcom elements as much as it is like these are the people that are always there for him. They're his core. They're his, the people instilling who he is and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Nailed it. No, absolutely nailed it. All right, Chris, we're on your your territory. We'll rip through these next few issues, and then we'll move on to your history of the Blue Beetle, and we'll head out. Next section is going to be issues, I believe it's 13 through 19.
Yeah.
And this to me is when I think it hits its stride.
I was gonna say it's the best.
This is fantastic. And if you're reading comics, and if Dylan says it and he's a huge fan, and I loved it. Like I again, this is why I DM'd you, man. I was like, I guess I just got into this. I'm like,
yeah,
okay, I get it. This is fantastic. And I went and bought the next trade, which wasn't too expensive. Then as I keep going, it starts getting a little more expensive because they're out of print and they're a little lesser print runs. This to me, if you want to get into DC comic books and it feels daunting, this was again, I'm still learning all the time. This is a great introduction to the DC universe as a whole, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of different characters, but it's not a lot going on, and you get the family dynamics, you get the origin of the Blue Beetle. Like again, last week, Dylan, you were alluding to a lot of stuff of the origins of the history of where this costume comes from. It's all broke down in here, the true intentions of where his armor comes from, what that means for the universe in general, and what you were pitching last week. And I'm like, God damn, this is fantastic. Like, and again, I don't think it's any coincidence that it's John Rogers and Albuquerque together that it kind of starts forming. Because to me, that's when it starts really hitting its stride. Giffen does some good stuff, but this is when it starts getting good. So I'll kind of throw it to you, man. Like, what about this issues? These comics kind of stand out to you? Is 13 through 19?
Yeah, so there's a lot, but I think the big thing that I'll always come back to with them is that this is the first time where you start getting, you get the individual stories issue to issue, but you're also having him with a larger arc, a larger enemy, a larger thing to be focusing on that's kind of pulling and piecing all of these things together, while at the same time, issue by issue, he's running into some of the biggest names in DC Comics, right? As you're just going through them. It's Guy Gardner, it's Superman. He's talking with Bruce Wayne. He's got, he's running into the Teen Titans. He's running into
Love that too, by the way. That was
right?
great.
Like he's fighting Lobo, right? As on the cover there. And so you're seeing him do all the, run through like kind of the greatest hits of the DC universe, but at the same time, he's got very much his own thing going on. It's an interesting kind of spin on a classic trope. Again, I'm trying not to give spoilers away as to what it is.
Not too much. Not too much. Yeah.
But it's like a kind of a new spin on the idea of a classic thing. And one of the things that I like about it is that when he is discussing things and learning about kind of who the overarching enemy is for him, it's done in like this. It's kind of ridiculous if you actually look at it from a story standpoint, because it's like a meeting and it's like, oh yeah, we know about your suit and things are great and we're gonna be in touch, but like we got like great stuff's going on, right? Like we're all
right, yeah.
And then at the very next page, they're just at war with each other, and you're just kind of like, what's going on here? How did that? Wow, that progressed really fast to see their true intentions, and they're just enemies now, and it's like, okay, that was kind of fast and ridiculous, and then the entire time where he's just kind of fighting them and everything they're throwing against him, and it's just like, oh, this like, what was that beginning? What was that start?
Right, yeah.
But I like that. I like that element. It just adds to the fun nature of this book, right? This is very much a, the stakes are high and they're there, but it's also just like him showing up and this is his job now. And he's got that kind of mentality about it. He knows what being a hero is, or at times he's still learning lessons, and they can be painful lessons. But that's kind of what's going on. And again, it brings the sci-fi elements. I don't know. It's just fun to read. Like you just burn through this one in a way that you don't a lot with comics, and I think that's just fun.
No, you brought up a great point. It totally is. Like you burn through it. And again, it really does start with that midway through of that second trade. So I would say from issue 7 from on, and again, I haven't read the other parts, so I'm excited to read eventually those other issues. I'm really digging it, especially with the cliffhanger we got at the end of issue 19 that we read here, and which I liked a lot. And I thought it was really cool to see this different dynamic, and like again, like the repercussions of people knowing your identity and not having it be a bad thing necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Like, but also the fallout of that, like not just the classic like, hey, I got you, my secret identity, you're in danger. Like, that's a fair assessment, but there's emotional repercussions when you're involved in this. And just again, the family being involved was interesting. It really does feel like it hits it. And again, I haven't read the other issues, so I'm curious, Dylan. And Chris didn't only read issue 12 because he's got his own little spiel we'll get to in a minute. Does it continue this all the way through the end? Because it only goes to issue like 30 something.
Yeah. So
what would you think?
The next trade is kind of finishing up the storyline that gets started in this one, right? Like
sure, right.
It's finishing up his battle against those guys, and it gets more direct and all that stuff. Again, avoiding spoilers. But it very much continues what this one's laying down. It just kind of progresses from there, and it gets more into everything. And then I think it's that next one, that last trade. So it's what issue? Let me see here.
30 something, like 30 to 35 or something like that.
Issue 26.
Okay.
And that's an interesting one because it closes out the arc of him, taking on who he has to take on and everything, and getting through that. And then it's just this nice little breather issue after all that, where it's him at a family reunion.
Oh, okay.
It's almost written entirely in Spanish. as
Oh,
he's
wow.
communicating with his family. There is a bad, a DC baddie who shows up, and he's got to deal with that. But that's the story, and it's kind of like this perfect, especially when you have these older trades. It's like this perfect little end cap to finishing up his first kind of big, larger story arc, and his big epic moment, and him taking on his own villain and all of that kind of stuff. And then it's just kind of him, taking the girlfriend to the family reunion. Oh, here's my crazy family. Okay. And the fact that it is all done in Spanish, I think is really, really cool
That's
as
awesome.
well. It adds a whole new element to it. So yeah, I like that next trade a lot as well.
Cool. Yeah, and I know there's like 2 more after that, I think, which I have that one, the one you're referring to. I think I
Yeah.
have that one coming, which I'm excited about. I'll finish reading that. And then, after that, I was looking at the other 2 issue or the 2 trades, and they're a little spendy. I'm like, "God
Mhm.
damn it." But I'm gonna check them out. I don't know, does John Rogers, that's a totally different person, Mr. Pink Floyd. Does John Rogers, does he write the whole thing after that?
No, no, he doesn't. So it looks like was this with 29 is where like kind of the fifth trade picks up, and that's Matthew Sturges
Okay. Okay,
uh,
cool.
writing. Yeah,
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so and that pretty much only it was only a year later, that's when they do the new 52, and that's when
right.
things get rebooted, and we don't
And
wanna
that
talk about the
one,
new 52.
I know, a whole other discussion. And that
Yeah.
one, the story gets more small scale, more focused on El Paso and the things going on there. You start seeing the social elements that
Okay.
get brought into it and things like that. And so it takes on a whole kind of new feel. But I think it continues really well, and it kind of fits with the evolution of Jaime as well, kind of going from as we all do, right, from teenagerhood to young adult, and you start being more aware of things going on around you and the larger picture. You're not as focused just on you and your friends and, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this, and finals, SATs, and then you're all of a sudden you're realizing where you are in the larger context of everything. And I think
Yeah.
that bit of storytelling does a good job of showcasing that with someone who's a superhero.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, I think we did a really awesome job of breaking down without spoiling everything about where to, maybe if you are going into these Blue Beetle comic books, where to start. Maybe to
Mhm.
know if it might be a little rough at first, but where things might start picking up for people and where to break that down. And I would say that I really enjoyed this last half a lot, and I'm really looking forward to reading that last trade I get. It sounds like it's a good, like, and I hate saying this, but a good jumping off point at that
It
fourth
is.
trade. It sounds like
Yeah.
it's kind of a bummer to say that, but I've said that, when comics create jumping off points, it's not always a good thing either. But at the same time, this is an older series, and it sounds like it's a good way to kind of, for me to wrap up my fandom of Blue Beetle as far as with this iteration. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, with comics, and there's so many of them at so many different times, and it just keeps going, right? Like, there is nothing wrong with just appreciating whether it's a whole series or just a couple arcs from a series where things are
Yeah.
just super strong. There is nothing wrong with just appreciating what that was, start to finish. You've always
Amen.
got that. You can go back to it. I absolutely love it.
Preach, preach, preach. And you can get these comic books again before we throw it to like Reverend here. Get these on DC Universe. Again, this is my favorite probably comic book site, to be honest. They have done a phenomenal job of being able to find these comics mega easy. You can put in Blue Beetle issue 5 and it'll bring you up all the Blue Beetle issue 5s that are on that system, which unfortunately it is not. I cannot say the same thing for Marvel Universe Unlimited, which is unfortunate. I never thought I'd say this to y'all, but DC Universe is the best comic service online. It is. It's fantastic. Get it on Comixology Unlimited, but you don't want to support Amazon, and you want to go to the BO. To me, this is the best kept secret in comics. Hoopla. Digital Comics. Also get it on trades if you want. So anyway, Reverend, I've made you do some digging here. So we watched the Blue Beetle movie, and I'm curious what Dylan, you can chime in anytime the Reverend talks. So just you can interject. But I made the Reverend here go on and say, I want to get me some deep dive a little bit for people to read some Blue Beetle comic books that aren't this Jaime, because in the movie they talk about the legacy of Blue Beetle, like in the comics. I love Ted Cord and that whole thing, being intertwined. So we're gonna go a little deeper. He's gonna give us some recommendations for people who want to go into a deeper legacy of Blue Beetle. Maybe you haven't either. I don't know. I'm curious what you've read and what you haven't read. So take it away, Reverend.
I was actually kind of surprised to learn that there's not an abundance of availability of Dan Garrett stuff, at least not through
I'm not
modern
surprised at that.
means. So, just in the interest of expediency and in making things reasonably accessible, honestly, I feel like the best place to start is right here. This is Blue Beetle Volume 5, Number 2, written and drawn by the great Steve Ditko. And this is pretty much the origin of Ted Cord, but it ties the origin of Ted Cord directly to Dan Garrett. So Dan Garrett is an archaeology professor. Ted Cord is a student of his. And basically, part of the plot is that one of Ted's relatives, his uncle, is trying to create a race of androids to take over the Earth. Where have we seen that before? We're kind of
Okay.
going back to some of the most formation, like some of the most founding kinds of like quote unquote silver / modern Blue Beetle stories by going here, and it's a really great one-stop shop to establish the lineage between Dan and Ted. About little under 20 years after this, because Blue Beetle, Charlton, Blue Beetle is a Charlton character, was one of the characters that was purchased by DC Comics in the early 1980s. And they basically used Crisis on Infinite Earths to bring the Charlton characters and incorporate them into the DC universe. So right after Crisis, there's a series that only really kind of just started called Secret Origins, and issue number 2 is basically a modern retelling of Blue Beetle Volume 5, number 2, but this time written by Len Wein with pencils by the great Gil Kane. And it's the most of the major beats of the stories are very similar. Dan is an archaeology professor. Ted has more of a electronic kind of countenance. It's like, why are you taking this class? And Ted's basically just like a student that wants to learn a bunch of different things, so that's why he's there. And the same basic stream of events takes place that ultimately leads Ted to become the Blue Beetle. The Scarab appears lost at the end of this with Dan Garrett, who appears to die at the end of this story. So that's what leads Ted to kind of go off and do his own thing and forge his arsenal, his costume, his vehicle with his family fortune to become the Blue Beetle. It's a fun read, and it's cool to see the relationship between Ted and Dan explored over the course of this in a little bit more of a modern context. And it instantly makes Dan Garrett part of the legacy of the DC universe in the post-crisis era, which I think is cool. So after that,
really quick, are they both these available on DC Universe?
Both of them are, yes.
Excellent.
So Len Wein, like I said, wrote this, and then he rolled right into a monthly series with Ted Cord.
No way.
From the early 80s, and it went for about 24 issues. It went for just about 2 years. It's a fun series. It certainly doesn't have the same kind of character that would be a hallmark of Ted's identity in the following several years under the hands of Keith Giffen, but it definitely holds its own. And there's a lot of really cool callbacks with other Charlton characters, including Question, as you can see here. But there's also a fun crossover with the new Teen Titans, but there's also a return of Dan Garrett in one issue of this series.
Damn.
And, it
kind of take long.
Brings the Scarab back as a mystical force within the DC universe. It doesn't really have its technological connotations yet that it will develop in the following years, but it's a part of it. And then so that went 24 issues. And
who's the artist on there? Do you know?
It shifted between several different artists.
Okay.
The names are escaping me at the moment.
Okay, they're good. I was just curious.
After this series ended, I think everybody will recognize this cover. Justice League International, I think for many people, is a definitive Justice League, even though there's just like one founding member of the team on it, but you've got a lot
And
of
he leaves
yeah.
like halfway, like not even halfway through, like after the first arc, basically,
He's
right?
not there for very long. I mean, this is around the time that he becomes more enthusiastic about being a part of the Outsiders. So, uh, when Batman steps away, Guy Gardner kind of tries to fill the leadership void here. And then, of course, a big component of Justice League International, as Dylan already talked about, and I think as all of us are thinking, is the friendship with fellow third stringer Michael John Carter, aka Booster Gold. This is a friendship I think that really does define this series for a lot of people. It
Yeah,
doesn't
for sure.
necessarily do a lot of favors for Ted as a heroic force in the DC universe, but it gives him a lot. I think over the course of the series, like he even has a weight problem, right? That he has to try and overcome. It's a
The
human
hell?
problem. It's a human problem, and he does eventually overcome it. And
Aw.
right there with him is his buddy. But Ted definitely gets his share of crap thrown his way over the course of the entirety of the run of JLI. But yeah, it's a fun series. If you haven't given Justice League International a try, I think it's certainly worth it. It went on for a long time.
It did.
The late '80s up through the mid 90s before DC decided to take the Justice League in a different direction by bringing the original founding 7 members back, albeit, it's Kyle Rayner, not Hal Jordan, and Wally West, not Barry Allen. But that was the team that was reunited by Mark Waid and then taken off in a whole new stream of adventures by Grant Morrison. But this series today, unfortunately, I feel like it kind of gets lost in the mix. And it's a
Really?
really important part of post-crisis DC history, especially up through something like the death of Superman, where you see that team really
Yeah,
unequipped to
that team
handle
looks
it
weird.
today. So,
Bloodwind. I mean, come on.
well, Bloodwind ended up being Martian Manhunter.
D-
But,
oh God! See, this is okay. This is where. No, no, don't tell me this. Okay, I got
yeah.
a couple things. Couple things. Justin Kowalski, if you're watching this, don't worry. We will cover the first arc of Justice League with you, or a good chunk of it with you. So don't worry. Next thing, Dylan, how familiar? I mean, I know you read these issues. How did you read the entire series?
I've not read the entire series. No, like I kind of
Okay.
went through and reading things online, kind of picked like the best ones
The
showcasing
cream of the
that
crop.
friendship between
Sure.
Blue Beetle and Booster Gold, just to kind of fill that in. Like when they decide to go and get an island and start a casino resort, a Justice League casino resort together, things like that. And I love it. I get why some Ted Cord fans sometimes have issues with things from this series. Like you said, it's not necessarily always showing him at his best moments, but I also just love the idea of, right, like we all have that one friend that can just kind of drag us down to their level sometimes.
Yeah.
It just happens, we all have that one person in our life. But I just love that for somebody who is as capable and as smart and strong-willed and all of that stuff as Ted Cord, he's just got this friend that just turns him into it takes him back to like when he was in college, and
Yeah.
that's the way they go together. I love that dynamic.
Get rich quick schemes that they're
Exactly.
both
Yeah.
doing.
Oh,
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
but another thing too that happens over the course of this series, especially for people who read it at the time it was coming out, what a shock, what awe. You read these stories, you go through things with these people, you develop a deeply
Yeah.
embedded affinity for someone like Ted Cord.
Mhm.
So by the time the series is over, the mid to late 90s are not a lot going on with Ted Cord. By the time we get to the early 2000s, the original team reunites for formerly known as the Justice League, which was a 6-issue miniseries, and it brings back that fun countenance that we expect from Giffen
Oh, the hell.
and Kevin McGuire. And you even got the elongated man thrown in there for good measure, along with Fire and Mary Marvel. But that went for 6 issues. There was a second
Wow.
arc that was going to be another mini, but they decided to put it into JLA Classified instead, which was running concurrently with JLA at the time. But then after that, there are only a few real key appearances of Ted Cord, some of which actually, interestingly enough, are in Birds of Prey. Ted actually has quite a few interactions and team ups with members of the Birds. And that also comes back in a way that I think is pretty biting and sad by the time we actually do get to
Infinite
this.
Crisis. Yeah.
Um,
This was a great story, and we raved about this issue back in the day when we did our review for Infinite Crisis, and I remember being like, "Okay, you won me over with this issue." What Jeff Johns, Wade was it Jeff Johns write it with Rucka, and it was joint
Jeff
effort too,
Johns,
right?
Judd Winnick, Rucka was
Judd
involved.
Winnick, yeah, he was
Phil
involved. Yeah,
Jimenez, yeah.
this is a fantastic issue for like setting up something like this, and I'm curious, and it definitely got me on board with Ted Cord, even though I had read the Brouhaha era, or at least a chunk of it anyway, a decent chunk.
Well,
It definitely got me on board.
that's what I
Good,
was
sorry.
talking about, because you read JLI and you feel this deep connection with Ted if you're coming
True.
off of that, so that by the time this comes around, it punches you in the face, and it punches you hard, because
Yeah.
this is a guy that you've seen do goofy things, but he's also standing up in the face of immense adversity. And it doesn't matter that he knows he's about to die. He faces his death the way that I think we all hope we will. And it's a really
Damn.
sobering story. And
Getting deep, Reverend.
it's the catalyst for everything that we talk about over the course of the Infinite Crisis binge, and it just reinforces how much of a loss Ted Cord really is to the DCU.
Yeah, it's true. This is a great. Dylan, have you read this issue? Have you read Infinite Crisis?
I haven't, and really just going through all this and the fact that like I've read this Blue Beetle series as much as I have, and I've never bothered to go back and read that is kind of ridiculous as I'm sitting here thinking about it. But it is true, right? Like Ted Cord became kind of the perfect person for this moment.
Catalyst,
right?
yeah.
Like coming off of Justice League International, like you talk about, because he does have the light, fun stuff with a Booster Gold that makes you like him and appreciate him, but he's still the adult in the room at times, and he's still kind of that strong will, that determined guy, that person who can be, kind of fill that role of the everyman on this team of superheroes. So you can relate to him, you can like him. If it was Booster Gold, everybody would be like, well, who cares? The guy was kind of like a jerk, right? It wouldn't hold as much weight. Whereas Blue Beetle was this perfect mix of fun and likable with relatable human, strong emotions. And I do think that, yeah, they kind of picked the perfect person for this, as hard as that it makes it.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you see over the course of this story, he's putting things together in the way that no one else is, because he has a different view of the board. And when he tries to bring other people into the fold, they just don't see it in the way that he does. And they like him and they want to help him, but they just don't think there's anything there. He's a mid-tier player. There's bigger things to focus on. In the lead up to Infinite Crisis, there was a ton of other things to focus on. So they took their eye off the ball. Most of and the guy who took his eye most off the ball, arguably, and who takes that loss on the chin the most, is Batman, because he's the one who actually does think there is a degree of credence to the things that Ted is investigating, but he still didn't act in a way that could have prevented his death. And it's one of the things that just makes, like, Ted Cord is the Franz Ferdinand of Infinite Crisis. He is the guy that sets everything in motion. And it really wouldn't be followed up on in a substantive way until well after Infinite Crisis was over. And Dylan, you alluded to this, and you've read this series, but we do get to see another interesting angle on what happened to Ted in Infinite Crisis through the time stream shenanigans of Booster Gold in the series co-written by Jeff Johns and Jeff Katz with Dan Jurgens on pencils. It is a superstar treatment for Booster Gold that he is not one. He doesn't get it very often, but you can see the twist already on this cover here. But it also leads to a fun alternate reality story that brings Blue and Gold back together again, and it's a joy to read. So if you haven't read this series, yeah, I highly recommend it. After this point, a few years go by and the New 52 comes around, and there's a new sort of conception of Ted. But Ted kind of goes to sleep until relatively recently. They did just do a new Blue and Gold series, I think, within the last couple of years. I have not read it yet, but I have it, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
Does not surprise me.
I love this duo a lot. So
Well, Chris, thank you for giving us what's available online for Ted Cord and the Blue Beetle and Dan Garrett, because I knew you'd do well. He would do a great job of this. So this is great, and it's great because you did give us some deep cuts with going with those initial issues that are on. This is all on DC Universe, and it's great. Like I can't like Steve Ditko. I mean, come on, he helped create.
Check this out. Just if you're a Ditko fan, man, I mean, there's a lot of even just the way that this cover is laid out. Like it's so
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's quirky in the way that Ditko was quirky.
Ditko was quirky.
Great.
There's no doubt.
Check it out.
No, for sure. And so I'm stoked about reading some of these issues. I love that we have access to this stuff. The one thing I'm going to say to you, Dylan, before we wrap up is, if you're going to read Infinite Crisis, read the Superman tie-ins. I know there are other ways of getting digital comic books, if wink wink out there, and they're not all on DC Universe, which I have no idea effing why they're not. But if you watch those videos of us, I rave about those issues. I'm not the biggest fan of Infinite Crisis. I think it's worth reading for you, especially. Mm-hmm. But those Superman tie-in books, in my opinion, are pivotal for the story, in my opinion. And I think they definitely need to be read. So
if for whatever reason you had $80 burning a hole in your pocket, get the Infinite Crisis Omnibus. They're all in there.
Well, I mean, that's an adequate. That's
1,300 pages, but you'll chew on that for a while.
Yeah, it'll last me a while, especially with the upcoming procedure I'm gonna have. I might have time on my hands.
Yeah, have a lot of time on your hands. Yeah, who needs that? So anyway, so Dylan, thanks so much for coming on, man. Like this was a blast. I mean, really is an honor to have you on. You do great work on, Emerald City podcast or Emerald City Hockey Hockey podcast with a deep dive. I always got those two things confused when I look for you guys online. I'm like, where the hell is this? I'm like, oh, it's a deep dive is a part of the, okay. Yeah. It took me a little bit to figure that out as far as back in the day when I started watching you guys, but it's been crucial for me to learn about hockey. And you guys are so a great entry point for someone like me who has no idea what the hell is going on. And I've learned a lot through you guys. And honestly, I really appreciate you just taking the time out to hang out with us and talk about comic books. It's been great to get to know you. And I appreciate your time, my friend.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been such a joy for me to be able to talk about one of my favorite characters, somebody who doesn't get talked about a lot. So to be able to come on, talk about this, history of different incarnations of the character, all that stuff, been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, man. And listen, for those who are probably wondering, I've already tried working Dylan back in at some point after his procedure. At some point when the season starts, we'll get him back on. We'll get you back on. We'll talk something. We'll leave it there. We'll talk something. So, Reverend, thank you for going on and giving us, preaching the gospel of the Blue Beetle legacy. I knew you'd do a great job. What you did, you killed it. I knew you would. Thank you for doing that.
No problem.
That was awesome. So why don't you tease next week out, man? Why don't we before we head out here?
Yeah, so we're going back into the zany territory of Grant Morrison and Batman with Knights Never Die, our very first episode. In fact, Paul, why don't you grab the book while I'm talking about it? But
thanks for preparing me.
Oh, yeah, we talked about it before. Anyway, to set up the journey that we're about to go on. So we talked a lot in our Zero episode, if you remember, about just the state of Batman in the DC universe at that point in time. But one of the really fascinating things that Grant Morrison does over the course of the run is they invoke really classic, long-standing Batman stories that go back to the 40s and 50s well before Crisis. The main thesis of the run that Morrison talked about is that everything counts. Every Batman story that was published has happened in one man's extraordinary life. So the baseline for that leading up to Batman R.I.P. is a collection of stories that Paul is holding called Batman the Black Casebook. The Black Casebook is an item that is referred to several times in those early issues of the run. And there you can see Chief Batman.
This happened.
Yeah, it happened.
Chief Batman happened, y'all.
It's part of it. But what it does is it provides a fascinating look at some of the history that Morrison will leverage leading up to Batman R.I.P. So I would categorize it as pretty essential reading, especially if you want to know the nuances of everything that Morrison is going to invoke over the course of the run. So we're thrilled to be able to bring that to you. It is a strange set of stories, but trust me, you're going to be happy that you read them.
Yeah, as long as this happened in reality, like I'm stoked. Like Batman fighting a purple monster. I mean, you can't beat that, man.
Yeah.
That's this is gonna be. Well, I'll tell a tale again about this when we do our episode with Javi.
Sure.
Javi,
Yeah.
the heart comes back next episode, which will be our first show of. Which, by the way, Chris, you need to just do the show outside of the regular Tuesday time slot. So just I keep pushing you to do it, for God's sakes.
That Black
don't wait
Case
for
Book
Tuesdays.
collection has one of my favorite titles of a story. Robin Dies at Dawn. It's just like, damn.
It sounds like an Evil Dead
Yeah.
title, to be honest.
It's a good one, yeah.
But yeah, it is good. So anyway, well, people, where can they find you, Dylan? Really quick.
Emerald City Hockey on X/Twitter at Emerald City HKY.
Sounds good. That's good. Yes, go follow. It's awesome hockey stuff right there. And Chris, Reverend, where can people find you?
At Chris Clow, CHRISCLOW.bsky.social.
That was pretty fast. I appreciate that. And you can find me on Twitter at...
Check out the new Trexpertise video, The Heart of James Kirk. You might see a familiar face.
Yeah, Star Trek is great. Anyway, yeah, follow me on Twitter at Herman22 with 2 N's, aka P Thug. Follow us on the socials. You see them right down there, all blah blah blah. Chris, why don't you take us out, my friend?
Read more comics.
You totally ruined that, but I'll accept it.
Nice.
All right.